Welcome back to Highly Successful Couples. I'm your host, Nick Solacek, and today I have a very special guest, someone that has made a big impact on me and my partner, someone that we've worked with in person, has a lot of wisdom to offer. So I'd like to welcome Melina McConnell to the show.
Hello, Nick.
And Melina, you are a somatic trauma therapist, have extensive training in a number of different modalities, and your work really brings together insight and information and data and science from a bunch of different fields. So maybe just to give our listeners a sense of who you are, what your approach is, you could frame that for them and let them know a little bit about your work and your practice here in Vancouver.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today, by the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I started off years ago. So I've been doing this counseling/therapy work for over 20 years. And originally started working as a counselor in the field of trauma and addiction. And it was through that process that I was realizing more and more, seeing different patterns in how people were coping or not coping with their addictions. The underpinning seemed to be unresolved trauma. So from there, probably 12 years ago or so, 10 years ago, I was delving into looking at other trauma therapies that would be less cognitive and more somatic based. At the time, I didn't really even know what I was looking for. I just knew that people needed help to understand the root cause of why they were suffering. And so I found somatic experiencing and took that training. And from there, that was essentially the sort of point of where I realized that I wanted to delve into more of a trauma-based approach that was more hands-on. So really supporting the physiology and the psychology and the neuroscience of what was happening for people when we tend to repeat patterns, across a lifespan. So from there, I've taken a lot of advanced trainings, touch-based, specifically for developmental trauma, and have also explored internal family systems model as well. So it's sort of an intersection of like 4 different kinds of models or modalities. So it's great just to be able to support people in different ways, be it a hands-on approach through touch or not.
So how does that work? Because if people go see a traditional psychologist or a therapist, the only touching that might happen is a handshake,
Right.
and there can be ethics and standards around that. And some somatic therapists have something called table work, where they will support a person's body, nervous system in a particular way.
Yeah.
And that might be placing a hand on an organ or neck or a foot or whatever's relevant to the process.
Right.
How does that actually work? How does you placing a hand on someone's brainstem or foot change anything about their behavior or the transformation that they want in their day-to-day life?
Right. So I do that work, as you know. Probably 90 or plus % of the work that I do is hands-on. So what we're doing essentially is supporting the nervous system to nervous system connection, right brain to right brain connection of what is actually meant to happen when we're babies. So even in utero, the right part of the brain develops first. So right brain is our emotions and our sensing. Everything that's nonverbal happens when we're in utero and up till we're about 2 years old, when the left part of the brain starts to develop more. So everything that we learn as little ones is through nonverbal cues of communication. So eye contact, nervous system to nervous system, being touched, being held, being saying to, those types of things. So essentially what we're doing with touch work is supporting the physiology to move out of survival states, so fight or flight or freeze, with hopefully another regulated nervous system on the other end, supporting the body to either demobilize from a high sympathetic activated state of like fight or flight, or to mobilize if somebody's in a freeze state. So these states are actually, the physiology is meant to be able to kind of flow between. So none of us are ever sort of out of one for a lifetime. But when we have the ability to be in an activated state and then self-regulate, moving into a more calm, it's called ventral state, naturally, it makes it easier to self-soothe and self-regulate. But for many, many people who have experienced adversity in childhood or developmental trauma, often aren't able to self-soothe and self-regulate. So the co-regulation needs to happen first in order to learn self-regulation and self-soothing. So we're essentially doing that with the touch at the table. So helping to support, for example, the kidney adrenal glands that are responsible for stress responses. So as a touch and being held in that area would be like what meant to happen when we're babies being held here, of that caregiver being able to support the child. The baby doesn't know how to self-soothe. They are fully dependent on their primary caregivers as the external regulator. And so we're doing that. We're essentially teaching the body to feel safe enough through a therapeutic relationship and, of course, consent to be able to say, okay, this is what was meant to happen that your little baby nervous system didn't get, and we're doing it now. So through that process as well, when the body feels safe enough to move out of the fight or flight, or if we've experienced shock trauma, it supports the body to complete a self-protective response. So that is different. That kind of trauma would be different than earlier childhood trauma, where we're not trying to complete anything. We're actually trying to learn how to be safe in the care of another.
So there's,
sorry, that was a very long-winded
there's so much there,
yeah.
yeah. And one of the phrases you used was developmental trauma.
Right.
And certain frameworks might say that that's when you're born to, throughout your childhood and adolescence, maybe 0 to 20.
Right.
And something that I've discovered working with you is that actually, that can begin before you're born.
Right.
That you can have developmental challenges or issues there. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So embryonic states of development, obviously being embryonic, being in the womb, depending what's happening with mom or mom and dad, and through our own histories, and if there is intergenerational trauma, can affect the growing fetus. So developmentally, if a baby is growing and developing in a state of stress, meaning mom might have high levels of cortisol, will potentially affect the development of that baby, of the fetus growing. So if there are high levels of cortisol in the system, or other stressors that are happening, can actually affect the developing brain and nervous system.
What would be some examples of that? Like, are there specific symptoms or common symptoms, maybe a person's experience of life that would indicate that was going on?
Yeah, so neurodevelopment, so things like ADHD or even autism can be a part of what happens in utero. So again, it's not about blaming any parents. I'm a parent too. And so, I like to first sort of caveat that with, it's not about blaming anybody. It's about understanding neurologically what can happen in a state of traumatic stress. So if mom's going through something really stressful during pregnancy, that can have the potential to affect the neurodevelopment of that baby. So we're seeing more and more, anyway, I don't want to get into the ADHD topic too much, but it can feel really confusing for people to understand, is it trauma? Is it stress? Is it neurodevelopment? So that's one factor that we're seeing more and more developing in terms of, again, the fight or flight or freeze response. So if a baby is in the womb and is in a state of chronic stress while it's growing, the child will potentially have impeded primitive reflexes. So our primitive reflexes will affect how we see ourselves in the world, some of the things that we might experience with regard to motor development, with regard to fears and phobias, with regard to social development. So there's a lot of varying factors that can happen with regard to like how we're developing. So what we're really talking about is nature nurture. What happens in utero developmentally, what happens afterward from those developmental years. when we talk about development, we're talking about until the brain has fully developed. However, most of us, when talking about early childhood or developmental trauma, developmentally speaking, is the earlier years, like 0 to 5, early childhood trauma until adolescence and so on. But really, the brain doesn't stop developing until we're 25.
Yeah. So as you're talking about this, there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about. And one is that our childhood adaptations become our adult problems in a certain way. Our parents are the master regulators of the household.
Correct.
And we can't learn what they can't teach us to do. And some of us are dealt, a particular hand of cards.
Yeah.
There's a difficult setup. We are in maybe situations that have more adversity than others. And I think something that would be really helpful to speak to here is, what can someone do to understand how they can work with this material? So if they're just getting started, if they haven't done somatic therapy, if they haven't done couples therapy, what's a kind of a classic example you might recommend, apart from, listening to a podcast like this, or maybe there's a book you'd recommend on the subject. Where could someone start? Because this can feel kind of overwhelming. It's like, whoa, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened in my childhood. I'm not sure what went on. I don't know what my mother was going through in that time. And when I ask her questions about it, she's not open to answering.
Right.
And there's so much of this that we can also just not feel, not be aware of, not know, kind of where to start. Is there any guidance you'd have for someone that's kind of getting started on this path or this journey?
If it was somebody that I was seeing and they came in the first time, or like a friend is asking, I'm noticing this thing is happening in my life. How is it a problem? What is it that somebody is experiencing that feels problematic in present time? So let's say they feel anxious, or they aren't having an easy time partnering up, or they're not having an easy time making friends, or it could be something physical, a somatic problem. Maybe they're in pain. So I would determine, first of all, what is it that they're curious about? And then look at, okay, so if it is, let's say, I don't know, anxiety, or that kind of like what you were talking about, they're in a relationship and they aren't sure if they want to continue being in a relationship, or they might have a flight response, or the partner's saying, when I talk to you about these serious things, like, you tend to shut down. So, whatever it is that the person's coming to me for, or in general, what's the problem, so to speak, then I would sort of steer somebody toward getting curious about what's happening from the emotional side of it, and what's happening, how it's translating into behaviors.
Yeah.
So that would be, and then, yes, of course, with the internet, we can kind of Google or listen to podcasts. If it is about, there's this ongoing theme happening in my relationship, or I'm noticing that I tend to want to be at home and I'm isolating. So I guess naming what the problem is, and then steering the person toward, some information that could be helpful. One of the things that I find for most people initially is the challenge that they have connecting to the body. So part of being conscious is having access to our body. And for a lot of people, we're not taught that. We're not taught, okay, you have these feelings or these behaviors that are happening. You might feel overwhelmed. What are you noticing inside your body? What is it that's prompting you to react like this? Most people aren't aware of that. So that would be something also that I would invite people to be curious about. So that word is called interoception. So what is happening with our thoughts, our emotions, and our sensations? So if we're having some tendency to react in some way to life, what is it that's telling you that this thing is actually happening?
When I started working with you, I had experiences like this where you would ask me, do you notice this about your body? How you're holding it? Do you notice that your leg is doing that? Or your head is doing this? And I would often have an experience that's like, oh, I'm not sure. Or, yeah, no, I don't notice that. And the same experience would happen with other things in my life where I might be at a dinner table and being a little bit shut down and quiet, and it would take my partner to acknowledge that or notice that, share her awareness with me. And I would say, oh, yeah, I don't know. Wasn't paying attention to that, or I wasn't aware of that.
Right.
And that there's, I'm just highlighting the fact that there's layers to this journey. And the body, we're hearing a lot more, I would say, in culture that like, oh yeah, what's your relationship to your body? Breath work is a huge thing. People are doing cold plunges, and there's always been a fitness trend of some kind, whether it's weightlifting or yoga or Pilates. But this is a little bit different because this is a more subtle kind of work, and it's not necessarily engaged in moving something heavy or immersing yourself in maybe a high stimulus kind of experience in nature or in the world. That there's something much more gentle and subtle about this, that I feel like, because we don't have that training that you're talking about, we don't have the role models or the guidance, we're like missing a lot of information.
Right.
And then we are in the world just reacting, responding, doing our best to deal with it. And we can end up coping in ways that can be hurtful to the system in our relationship, hurtful to the family, hurtful to ourselves.
Yeah. So it can feel subtle, but it can also be extremely overwhelming. So for some people who have experienced harm to the body, we cut ourselves off. So the simple question of what are you noticing can be extremely triggering for people who haven't had access to their body for a variety of reasons. And so the titration and the gentleness and the time to be able to even go inside for some people can be excruciating. So they'll do like everything to not feel the body, including like substances. Because if we've been, like I said, if we've been harmed or we've had experiences with physical trauma of some kind, it can be very, very difficult to even want to go anywhere near noticing what's happening. So then we're very much in our heads. So we're walking around very left brain. Yeah. And then it, like you said, it can take sometimes somebody pointing it out. Like, oh, I'm noticing that you're not very engaged. Or did you notice that somebody said something and you had no reaction? Where that can be one person's experience, or someone else could be in that same kind of situation and have a really disproportionate big reaction to something. So the research says that there's about over 80% of the information that we're taking in from the external to the internal, 80% is from the body to the brain. But we're so heavily dominant in our thinking parts, in our culture, that we miss that whole transaction that can happen from something happens outside of me, there's a reaction in my body, and then I'm interpreting it in my brain. But we tend to think that something happens and then we think about it. So it's very quick, that connection between, oh, I get this gut reaction, right? The gut reaction is literally the gut. That sends the signal up through the nervous system to the brain to determine, oh, this is important or this isn't important. And then we try to make meaning out of it.
So there's a phrase that's really popular. It's kind of a cliche, trust your gut.
Right.
And maybe I can give a personal example. I've shared publicly that over the last 5+ years, there have been moments where Alyssa and I have been deep in our power struggle, unresolved personal issues coming up from the past. We've felt unsure about how to resolve it. I was the person who was more resistant or more withdrawn or more shut down, more of that minimizer type. She was more of the maximizer. We need to talk about everything. We need to solve this. And we'd go back and forth on that. And it would get us to places where we felt a lot of shame. We felt hopeless about our situation. We weren't sure what to do or how to work through it or when this experience would end. And there are moments, I'll just say for me, not speaking for her, that I felt some conviction, high level of conviction, that in my body, that, I think maybe it's time to end this relationship, that it's time to move on and find a new partner or go on my own journey. and that this can't be solved, or I don't want to, or whatever the other sentiments were. And over time, staying with the process, not, acting on that feeling, being curious about whether that's true, because it's a big decision. And I don't want to flip my life upside down just, overnight. What I came to is like, oh, that's not really my full truth. And there was more fear in that than there was maybe presence or other qualities that could benefit our experience of relationship. Right. And maybe you could speak to this a little bit and help clear up, like, oh, should we always trust our gut? And should we always trust how our body is feeling? And, you just got to trust yourself, and you just got to go with it.
Yeah.
Could you add some?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Kathy Kane, one of my teachers, mentors, says, we're not always the best witness to our experience, which I love, because from what you described, there's a lot going on there. So if we think of neurobiology, the amygdala and the hippocampus make up our defense circuitry. So amygdala is fight or flight, or like I think of it like a threat antenna. So it's kind of like the thing that's like beep, 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 beep. This is like that. So I need to react. And then the hippocampus very quickly comes in with a memory and says, oh, this is like this other time, and potentially I need to flee, I need to run, or I'm going to shut down, or sometimes people will fight back. So very quickly, all of that goes on. And then, like you say, you have this gut reaction. But the sometimes overreaction, or sometimes underreaction, if we're not responding at all, is often the part of us that wants to protect something that might feel painful. So let's say, and I don't know the exact situation, but let's say the two of you are talking and there's something that gets triggered in you where then you have this defensive part that comes up. And maybe it feels really vulnerable. Maybe you feel criticized. So there's a part of you that's going to protect another part that doesn't want to feel shame or doesn't want to feel criticized. And so it's like, okay, well, as a way to avoid that, I'm going to get the heck out of here. So then there's this impulse to run. But because you have the self-awareness, it's like, oh, okay, so there's that going on. And what can I do rather than flee? How do I now take some time to slow the process down? And that's part of being regulated. When we can, like from a nervous system perspective, how do I, in a moment of conflict, take a pause, slow the process down, spend time with myself to say, okay, how can I reflect here? What is actually going on? So I have a part that feels defensive. I have a part that wants to run away. And maybe then if I can connect with those parts, it's like, what is it trying to protect? And maybe it's something like we were talking earlier before we started about the past. Is this a childhood experience that I had? Or is it that in the moment I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling run down, and I'm not feeling heard? Or is it something else? So when we can take that pause, check inside. What is actually happening? Can I lower my heart rate? Can I spend time internally trying to explore what's going on? And sometimes when we can't do that, then that's when we, come to therapy and say, okay, these are the things that are going on. And I don't want to have these kind of reactions, but if my natural go-to from when I was a kiddo was wanting to get the hell out of here, and potentially I couldn't because of whatever circumstances, I'm just speaking in general, as an adult, we can, right? We have choice now. We don't have helplessness in the same way we do when we were little. So that's often when we have a little bit more maturity to go, okay, if this is a theme for me and my natural tendency of when I feel somebody's giving me like critical feedback and I'm being defensive, or I feel threatened, how come? What is it that I'm trying to protect by leaving?
Yeah, great question. So you mentioned childhood memories there, and in my work, the Imago philosophy is constantly pointing towards childhood, childhood memories, and memories of the past, and that there's this historical context often driving the reactivity today that the power struggle that couples experience is largely driven by this history, this pain from childhood, the original rupture and disconnection with caretakers, the misattunement that took place. And now here we are attached to another individual, and we're experiencing the similar thing. And when I'm doing this work with couples and individuals, I will work with or encounter people who do not remember childhood, have foggy memories, aren't able to articulate some of the things that were going on, or describe the strengths and weaknesses of their caretakers, mom and dad. So one question I'd love for you to speak to is, what happens if we don't remember? Are there reasons we don't remember? And do we need to? You know, do we have to heal, to grow, to live a life that we enjoy?
Yeah. So just to speak first to attachment, it's so important the first couple of years of life. It really is the blueprint in terms of how we will then potentially attach or not attach to friends and potentially romantic partners later. So there's so much research. There's so many great people having done research for years, like Alan Shore, for example, in terms of what goes on neurologically, what needs to happen to really foster bonding. That could be a whole other episode just on the attachment. So the thing during that developmental time also is that it does put in a blueprint into, again, the nervous system, right down to the cellular level, and our fluid systems are even influenced by our experiences. So the body will remember certain things, even if we don't consciously, cognitively remember. So sometimes when we're not remembering, it's because we will remember the things that are sometimes most important, and we will also dissociate from things that are harmful. So it's kind of like, there was an analogy once that somebody spoke about around a house full of items. If we kept every single item that we were ever given from birth and had it in a home, we would consider that hoarding. And so we get rid of certain things and keep the things that are over time often most important or more meaningful. And so similar to our memories, we cannot possibly remember everything. It would our brains just don't work that way. So we parcel out some of the things that are harmful or hurtful and shut down. Thankfully, we have parts that are able to dissociate. Otherwise, a lot of times we wouldn't cope, we wouldn't live. So over time, when we feel safe enough, we can start to sort of extract some memories that we might have blocked out. So from an IFS perspective, often they're called exiles, parts of us that we've exiled, that we've sort of buried, as Dick Short says, way deep down into the dark depths of the basement, because it's too painful to be feeling it all the time. Sometimes we will be able to bring that memory back, and sometimes not. But it doesn't mean we can't heal. Sometimes memories get held, like I was saying earlier, in the body. So we might have a somatic response to something that we don't consciously remember. So for example, I could say like a car accident. If somebody is in an accident and they get knocked unconscious, the body will hold that memory and will show up later down the road even as like an incomplete self-protective response, that bound stress from that period of time will be thwarted. As the body feels safe enough, that body memory might come up and we might be able to explore it in a somatic way. Same with being attuned to, being held, like I was saying earlier. For some people, that will evoke a freeze response, being touched. They're not used to being held in a tender way with somebody caring and comforting them, that the body might freeze, but over time, the unwinding of the scared part of the body may start to soften down. And at that point, as we feel safer, we might have access more to the conscious memory or the episodic memory. but not always. So sometimes our gut reaction could be based on something that we've experienced before, and sometimes it might not be, that it might just be a reaction to what's happening in present time. But when there's themes of reactivity that happen over long term, that's generally where I would be inquiring around, the childhood, past experiences. Like, again, if parents aren't wanting to talk about certain things, or they're no longer here, somebody has passed on and maybe there was something adverse that happened, it's like, okay, well, let's just go with the fact that this feels really unsettling and that there's something here, whether it actually happened or not. So kind of getting into more of the trauma responses, something that could be perceived as overwhelming and threatening is also important to listen to. So it's not always, like, our memory may not always remember exactly the way it happened back then. So if a lot of time has gone by, as we remember things, we may remember them differently. Not to say that it didn't happen that way, but we go with, like, how is it affecting me now in present time? And let's explore that.
So there's really an immense amount of insight and perspective here that you're sharing. And one thing that I want to drill down on a little bit was this example you gave of it being uncomfortable, maybe to be touched in an adult relationship, or that there's something about gentle touch that might feel awkward or unfamiliar or scary. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking, that probably doesn't make sense to most people. Like, well, why would it be? I know people that are not comfortable going for a massage. And to me, I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like,
Right.
Why would you not be comfortable going for this relaxing, amazing experience?
Right.
And obviously, I have enough awareness to understand that, my experience is not other people's experience. So in this example where it might be uncomfortable or it might generate a freeze response, what could have happened for someone that would create that in
kind
their
of
adult
response?
relationship?
So violence of some kind, birth trauma could evoke that kind of response. The lack of care, attunement, and touch when we're little, if we haven't been hugged and told I love you, can feel really off-putting for some people. Of course, sexual trauma would be one of them. Witnessing violence, being harmed in some way, not trusting people for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I imagine that would be also a very confusing experience to the romantic partner. If that person is paired up with them, they have this desire, this yearning to be in relationship, and they have this other piece that's unresolved.
Right.
As we all do, we've all got something, unresolved, something that we're working on. What would be a recommendation you might have to a couple in that situation?
Yeah. So sometimes it can feel confusing even for the person who is having an adverse response to touch or being comforted, particularly if let's say it was a sexual trauma that happened really early in life that they might not have a lot of conscious memory of, but they know that their body responds in this way. So it's a really tricky one because it depends if somebody's exploring that in their own therapy or not. But let's say that somebody knows this about themselves and they're not really sure why. It's like, I love my partner, I want to be with them, I want to feel close, and it's really difficult. So I would suggest for that person to share that this is what's happening, and that even though it doesn't really even make sense to the individual themselves, that they're recognizing that there's some fear coming up in their system, that it's not necessarily about the partner. They know the partner has their best interests, that they're really loving and tender toward them, but that their body tends to have these fear responses. So for some people, it may be just kind of going slower. It's like, okay, let's get to know each other again. What does feel okay? If I put my arm around you, if we're holding hands, if we're looking at each other. So being really intentional with the kind of care that the individual may be able to tolerate. So sometimes I've seen people and even couples over the years where they have been sexually active with each other, and then for seemingly no reason, they're suddenly feeling more afraid, that the body is just responding to their partner, and it can feel really confusing. Nothing that they know of has happened. There hasn't been any thing traumatic happen, and suddenly they just don't feel as safe as they used to. So exploring, like I said, what feels okay. Can we sort of slow the process down and come back to getting to know each other again, being more like open, communicatively speaking, starting to go back to how do you feel in the presence of this person? Can you sense that they're there? And this is something that we do in therapy, is that you're here, you're your own individual, and I'm here as a support. How does it feel? And you and I've talked about this. How does it feel sensing you and then sensing me, and then what's in between is the resonance. So that process for some people can take a really long time, and for some people right away they love it. They want to feel close and connected, and for other people that process needs to be slowed down. So that's what I would suggest, is like coming back to, can you sense that the person's there? Can you hug and feel a hug, the warm hug, or does it feel like you want to pull away? So just exploring that kind of, it's titration. A little bit here. How does that feel? This feels good, but not this. Mm-hmm. And it takes being open and willing for the two people, in a partnership, to be willing to do that kind of process together.
Yeah. Well, I have had this experience in person in session with you and my partner, where I was asked that, can you sense yourself? Can you sense your partner right now? Mm-hmm. And when I was asked it in the first place, sort of no.
Right.
Yeah. I'm actually focused on me, mm-hmm. and I'm feeling defensive, or I'm feeling angry, mm-hmm. or I'm feeling what I'm feeling, and I'm self-absorbed in my experience.
Right.
And now I'm not empathetic. Now I'm not curious,
mm-hmm.
and mm-hmm. maybe I never really actually had a great capacity to sense what other people are feeling.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I can see how that would be an enormous challenge for some people. Others might quickly get it and notice, and with some practice be able to integrate that.
I would say most people, it's not a natural thing to do. So what we're talking about is attunement. And it's really hard when we're triggered. So that attunement of noticing, oh, okay, this is what's going on for my partner. How can I come closer to them? For some people that may have a more anxious attachment, they're like, oh, I need this person to be like right here in order to feel them, and I don't want to let them go. Somebody who may be more avoidant is like, oh, you've got that going on, that feels like a lot, and I need to be back here. So that definitely takes practice. There's not very many people that I've met, they probably wouldn't be coming, right? Sure. If they had that already dialed in. So for some people it's a practice, and it's like learning that that's even a thing to do, especially when we can be so sort of absorbed in our own experience and when there's bigger emotions. But what I would invite people to do is doing it at a time and practicing when we're not in a heated moment. You could be hanging out together watching a movie. It's like, oh, okay, we're snuggled up on the couch. What do I notice? What's happening with my heart rate? Do I feel cozy and warm? Often in those moments, we're not really noticing, and we feel comfortable. Being able to take that in a little bit and being present to the fact that it feels easy, that is beautiful to be able to do that. And then can we do that if there's something bubbling up, if there's a conflict?
So as you mentioned TV, I was thinking about, I believe the term is selective dissociation, or if somebody made that up. But what I've come to learn is that sometimes when there's tension or conflict or upset in my relationship, it's appropriate for me to care for my partner, listen, show some curiosity, ask her if there's something that she needs from me. And sometimes we get to places where that's not really available. Right. Like it feels like deadlifting 500 pounds to try to hang in there with each other.
Yeah.
And we notice that taking a walk, taking a break, maybe making a commitment to come back in 30 minutes can be helpful. Also watching television for an hour and having some escapism, immersing ourselves in another reality, giving our brain something else to focus on, can also be helpful to reset a little bit and to calm down.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, because there's unhealthy uses of everything. We take it to the extreme. But I find it interesting that television or another activity could actually be helpful for couples to work through a moment
Right.
that they're going through.
So I think the key in what you just said is coming back to it 30 minutes later or whenever there's an agreed upon time. So that's the thing where a lot of people will do. It's like, okay, we have this conflict and we're going to do a little bit of time out, and then it never gets talked about again. And people just want to shove it under the rug and pretend like it doesn't exist. So such a key part of resolving conflict and repair is coming back to it and exploring it. So what you do together or separately, that to me is kind of like, okay, if we're escaping watching some show and then we come back to it, that can allow the brain to shut down for a bit and not have another task being put on top. Having a boundary around that and communicating, like, I feel like I'm at my max right now. Like, I love you. Nothing's changing. I'm not leaving. Knowing if that's distressing for the partner to have that time away, but being able to communicate it ahead of time. So having those agreements before a conflict can be helpful, especially if we know that we get to our limit and it's like, you know what, I'm going to need some time here. If we know that that's a pattern that we get in, let's like have that as an agreement before things get to sort of an even more conflict induced time. So being able to say, hey, you know what, I'm at my max right now. Let's like, I'm going to go for a walk or I'm going to watch something, but I want to talk about this when I'm calmer.
Yeah.
Is usually more helpful.
Sounds like an important guardrail. These boundaries you're talking about, that, okay, it's okay to be upset. It's okay to not agree. It's okay to have a moment of tension. Conflict is going to happen to some degree. There will be friction between couples. And that we have some agreements about how we disagree. We have some agreements about how we fight.
Right.
And that there's a sentiment of, I care about you, you're important to me, and I really feel like I need this right now. And can we come back to it? So there's always one person that's distressed by separation, distressed by closeness. So when someone just gets in their truck and goes for a drive or retreats to their den and fires up the TV and doesn't say anything.
Yeah, it can be hurtful for the other person and feel confusing.
Yeah.
And especially if they have a history of being shut out, or if they feel like, you know, here I am again and I'm too much and this person can't handle me. That can feel really hurtful and scary for the person being left, right? So if somebody has an abandonment wound around that kind of experience, so again, communicating that and being respectful. It's like we can argue. How do we argue well? We can have disagreements. How do we still allow the other person to have their feelings and not try to convince them to, you know, to do it the way I do it? So to be able to give somebody that space and time to be able to explore what they need to be able to come back, and also maybe not too long if we know that the other person is in distress, because we don't want to leave the other partner in distress either, but it's managing like what that time frame is going to look like. So what I would suggest to the person needing to leave is looking at, okay, so what are the parts that are trying to protect? What is the part that's being triggered? Can I go back in and have that conversation? So I would say to check in, let's say it's anger or frustration, checking in with, okay, I have this part of me that's really angry or pissed off. Okay, so I'm going to go and have this conversation. Can I have it now? And if that angry part is still angry, it's like, okay, maybe I need to wait. And then give it another 10, 20 minutes. Okay, how about now? This is how I want to show up in my self-energy. I want to be in a self-leadership role here. Can I do it? And if it's like, no, I'm still angry, it's like, okay. And then looking at, what does the angry part need? What does it need to feel heard? Maybe it's not that it's the thing that you're going to share with your partner, but can I self-soothe? Can I comfort the angry part of me before I come and talk to the person so that I can speak for that part? So it would look like, hey, Nick, I have a part of me that's angry because X, Y, and Z happened. Like, this is what I wanted instead, for example, rather than coming in fiery and angry, like, I'm so angry and you did da-da-da. So it's like speaking for the part that got angry.
So I feel like what you're describing is a masterful kind of approach. In some ways, I feel that it's rare because I get so many emails and I get so many messages describing what can be really fearful, anxiety-inducing experiences with people who are together, people who are married, and they get into these conflict loops and these repetitive cycles that make them feel hopeless and frustrated. When it comes to our relationship, something that you have shared with me, and you asked me this question one time in a session when Alyssa and I were feeling some tension or disagreement, or maybe we felt like we were on opposite sides of the same world on a key issue. And the question was, tell me about why you're in this relationship, or, why are you together? And you ask that question the right way, it can come off as challenging, or it can be heard as kind of pessimistic, or, like as if you're like, why are you guys together? But really you're asking like, tell me about your why. And what I sensed was that you were asking me to connect to my vision and my intention, and what is this about, and what do you want it to be about? Is this important for couples, that they have to know this and can't just love, carry them over the years? Yeah.
So I just want to name one thing first, and then is it okay to come back to that?
Yeah.
So what I would suggest, like you were saying, it's nuanced to be able to get to know our parts and what's going on and speak for them. But I would suggest for people and invite them to write down their triggers, because there's usually themes. We know in couples how to push each other's buttons. So what are the triggers, and like, how come? What is it that's going on for somebody where every time the person says this or does that or has that facial expression, that there's some energy around that? So I just wanted to share that. It can be so helpful to start to get to know, what is my part in this? How come, even after 10, 20, 30 years, I'm still triggered by this thing?
Yeah. So you're suggesting that me and my partner, for example, we would have a note or a list, or maybe it's on the fridge, that these are Nick's triggers, or these are...
Well, it can be that, absolutely. So Stan Tacken calls it the manual, giving and working out an owner's manual. You don't own the person, but it's like the manual of what makes Nick tick, what makes Alyssa tick. So that way you can go, oh, okay, these are the things that I know are going to be super upsetting to her, and I love her and I care for her and I don't want to do this, even though sometimes, I can't help myself, but I know if I do this thing, it's going to create conflict potentially. So yes, you can do that. I don't know about necessarily writing down like all of the triggers, but having that conversation together, I think first of all, getting to know your own triggers first and then sharing it with the other can definitely be helpful. Yeah. So coming back to the purpose. So I think it's like, what is the shared purpose of your relationship? Why are you together? How come you and how come the other? So that there is a shared joint purpose. And I tell you, most people don't know. Most people haven't really thought about it. It's like, oh, we love each other. It's like, yeah, that's great. You could love, your someone else, a pet. It's not the same. So why are we together? Why this person? And what, like you said, your vision. Why are we together? And what are we doing as a way to work together in the relationship? What is our purpose now? And do we have a shared vision for the future? And if so, how do we get there? How do we protect each other from each other? So kind of like what I was saying before with having sort of the manual of like what makes each other tick. It's like, okay, so if I know these things about myself, then I can share that. And if I don't and I'm being triggered, how do I explore that with or without the other person?
When you said that a lot of people don't have a purpose or they don't have a vision.
They haven't really thought about it.
Yeah, they haven't maybe taken time to speak about that with each other. There's so many different exercises that couples could do, writing exercises to craft this out. Imago has one. Many different modalities have a version of this. So there's a lot of different ways you could create a relationship vision, but I feel like sometimes couples are stuck on something like, well, we're together because we've got kids. We're together because we have a business together. And I don't mean to suggest that those aren't good reasons, but they're sort of just there, that there isn't maybe another layer to that, or a hopeful vision or a dream. People do have visions and dreams and things they want to realize with their family or their business, but that they haven't taken time to intentionally think more about what could be possible. Are there specific questions that somebody might journal on, or a sentence stem that they might answer to try to add some shape or texture or context to this conversation?
Yeah. So again, with Stan Tacton, who created the PACT model for couples, he will say, what does this person do for me that nobody else in the world does for me unless I pay them? So that can
what
be,
does this person do for me that no one else does for me
unless I pay them? So that can be a way to go, okay, so what are the things that I love and adore or respect about the person that I've chosen to spend my life with? What does this person do for me? So sometimes we forget, especially over period, like if people are together a long time, like you said, if they own a business or kids, the focus becomes that versus the partnership. So how do I connect? Let's say they're called thirds. There's a third in the relationship. So if we're only focusing on the third, then we forget about you and I. So how do we come back to that?
So just to clarify that term for people that might not understand it, a third could be a child, it could be a friend, it could be a family member. Right. And in Stan's work, he talks about that the couple needs to protect themselves from thirds in certain ways.
Right.
Like an intervening or invasive family member who's over-opinionated, or a friendship that could feel inappropriate to one partner. Are there other definitions or maybe distinctions you'd like to add to that idea of a third?
Well, I think when it can interfere in the couple bubble. Right. So it could be anything from work to children to... So the priority is meant to be the partnership. Not that we don't love our kids and friends and family and colleagues, but we need to be intact. The couple needs to be intact to be able to manage what's outside of that. And so then coming to your question of reflecting on, like, how come this person and why are we together? Part of that is that, like, what are we doing together that's going to help us manage the other things that are happening in our lives?
Yeah. There's another piece to that which you've asked, so related to relationship vision, related to where are we going? What do we want to create? How good could this get? What do we value? What is this thing all about? And how can we protect ourselves from outside threats, people's opinions and judgments or ideas about who we should be? Inside of that two-person system you're describing, there's also sometimes this oppositional thing that goes on where we do things that hurt our partner. And it could be, oh, I just work all the time.
Right.
Could be that I secretly watch pornography. Could be that I spend lots of time outside of the house with my friends and not making plans with my partner. There's so many things that could happen. I shop compulsively online and spend all our money. Or I gamble and I don't tell my partner about my wins and losses, and I have a secret stash. As I'm describing these things, I'm just kind of coming back to the beginning of the conversation where you talked about the way that we cope with trauma, the way that we cope with life, and that we can make certain choices. We can put our energy in certain directions to cope with that. It's sort of about maybe us and what we're dealing with, but it can hurt our partner.
Right.
And that there needs to be a consideration of, hey, why would I do something? There needs to be some awareness of, an inquiry of why would I do something that maybe hurts us or hurts the system or hurts myself. And I'm asking that from, sitting here in this position. But if someone's totally wrapped up in or is truly in this sincere, process that they're in where maybe they're not aware, maybe there is denial, that they're coping with something, is there something you would suggest to that the people in that system, in that dynamic, of something to look at?
So I guess it would be, how is it affecting the other person? So if it's affecting the other person, let's say it's a financial thing, and now the gambling is now spilling over into affecting like how we can spend our time and our resources, that becomes, a problem. So part of it would be, okay, so how come the person's gambling, for example? What's propelling the person to be secretly doing whatever it is that they're doing? What are they trying to cope from? So what is the underpinning? Is it stress? Is it a habit that they've had for a really long time, even before the partnership? So I would invite the person particularly to get curious about what it is that's happening that's propelling them to do something in secret that they feel that they can't be transparent with their partner. So then the communication around that, often people will withhold information because they're afraid of the reaction of the partner. So maybe they need to get some facilitation around that, how to talk about something that's, becoming a problem where it's not really being discussed openly. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people do the things they do and why they have secrecy. But if somebody is in a relationship where they're not able to talk about the thing that's happening for them and they're suffering in silence, if it was a client of mine that was doing that and they said, I have this thing that I've been doing that I haven't been able to share with my partner, then I would explore that with the person. So I would invite anybody listening to just get curious about why it is that it's difficult to share that. Or if I'm unwilling to change it, knowing it's going to be a problem, then I would get curious about that too.
One of the things I'm thinking as you're sharing that is that, first of all, powerful inquiry, and that generally people lie because they had to. They can't be transparent now because they couldn't before, that
Right.
There was something going on in the family of origin where it wasn't okay to be me. It wasn't okay to tell the truth.
Yeah.
That there could be big consequences or guilt trips or punishment of some kind as a result of me telling the truth about my feeling or what I'm thinking about or what I want to do. And would you agree that generally that could be a pattern?
That can definitely be a pattern. And then it's hard to trust oneself that even if the partner has some kind of reaction, that they're going to be okay, that they're not going to go into some kind of shame spiral of having to disclose, I've been doing this thing for a long time and haven't been able to tell you, or trusting that the other person will respond in a way that's going to keep the relationship intact. Yeah, so definitely that can be, again, carried through, like you were describing, from our childhood. If we weren't able to be open and transparent and authentic growing up, it makes it really difficult to then naturally be able to trust other people.
Yeah. So when it comes to trusting other people, there's something here about also being able to trust ourselves. And I wonder if you could speak to that, because I work with a lot of people who have self-identified trust issues. And what that might look like is they've gone through this breakup, there was infidelity, their previous partner lied about all these things. And they're asking, how can I learn to trust again? How could I ever, trust that my partner is going to care for me, that they're going to look after our best interests and tell me the truth about what's going on.
Yeah.
And I know it's difficult to give a prescription or one solution, but is there anything you would say to somebody that's asking that question? They're in that place of pain and uncertainty.
Yeah. So difficult to have been betrayed, because it really does rock the core of often our existence, kind of like what you were describing. How did I not see these things? How did I not know? And often people carry so much shame around having been in a relationship with somebody for however long and not have seen the signs and been completely blindsided. It can be so destabilizing. So I think one of the first things that I would suggest is working through the physical reaction to that. It like really finding some centeredness and grounding and nervous system stabilization of feeling. It's like a tremor inside often that people will have for sometimes a long time. So being regulated, coming really back to oneself. It's like, okay, I need to put the things that happen sort of over here for now and really come back to feeling my own body, feeling my own self, feeling my heart rate, feeling kind of like we were talking about earlier, just really from a somatic perspective, really sensing into, can I root and ground myself? So from that place, then once we start to be able to feel more of our own sense of self, our self-energy, our regulation, to then be able to attend to the different parts of us that have been traumatized by what happened. So sometimes, I often say denial is sincere. We don't often see the things that we could have seen because of our own previous experiences. We all have blind windows. We all have blind spots of things that we don't see within ourselves. Our brains and bodies will deny our own experiences as a way to avoid pain. So once somebody is starting to regain a sense of themselves, they'll often reflect back and go, you know what? There were things that happened that I overlooked. And then that again is like, oh my gosh, how did I overlook that? Why didn't I know? And then sometimes our own self-criticism will come in. Why didn't I do anything the first time? I let it go and I shouldn't have da-da-da-da-da. So we shame ourselves also for really overriding some of the things that we may have experienced. And there are people that I've worked with absolutely who had no idea and have been completely blindsided by really significant betrayal. So again, coming back to oneself, it's like, okay, so these things happened. And how do I now start to look for my own gut reaction? How do I come back to my intuition? And often with early childhood trauma, we don't have access to our intuition. If we're in a freeze state, if we're in a shut down, non-responsive kind of way to the bad things that have happened to us, we often aren't accessing the right part of our brain, which is also our intuition. And so I would say being really gentle to oneself, recognizing that there's a lot going on often with the nervous system that will keep us away from our emotions and our feelings, and it's meant to protect us when we feel safe enough to be able to explore that with someone who we do trust, like loved ones, friends that we trust, or in therapy, to be able to start sort of unpacking some of the emotions and somatic experiences that can happen from that kind of trauma.
Would you say that this is a pattern for people who experience betrayal over and over again? You can't trust men, you can't trust women, or all relationships are a failure. People don't believe in commitment anymore.
Yeah.
They're having this experience over and over again that is connected to this maybe freeze state that they're in, or that lack of relationship with their intuition, that they're missing some key data. They're not noticing key signs. As the internet might like to say, they're missing red flags, ignoring concerning behaviors, things that...
Yeah, often if we're not taught boundaries when we're little, then we don't know that we even have a choice to do that growing up. So if we're not taught that saying no is okay, or that we can express ourselves, or that we have likes and dislikes, there's many people who don't have those experiences. So often that's where we get into codependency. And so over time, learning, oh, right, I actually now, because I'm not a child, I have a choice. And making the choice can be extremely painful if it means ending a relationship that you don't want to end. But in that process, when we stay for longer than what is helpful for us, we're really self-abandoning. So once we know, okay, there's this thing going on and I don't like it and I might have this gut reaction, okay, I need to listen to that. And so often we're afraid of the loss of a relationship that we give people way more latitude than what is really helpful or healthy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, again, like we could kind of go into different areas and ages and life experiences. But if it's happening, like you said, as a theme, then I would be curious about what's happening for the individual where it's difficult for them to sort of intuit that what is happening isn't really okay. Where did they get that message from? That they're still in a situation that really isn't helpful. And leaving particularly abusive relationships is very difficult. There's so many influencing factors as to why people stay. So I'm not trying to minimize the magnitude of what it's like to leave, especially if we don't have people who taught us that it's not okay from the beginning. But if we grew up in an environment where that was familiar, I can't remember who it was. Oh, it was like an Indigenous elder that basically said, we marry our unfinished business.
Well said. Yeah.
So trying to interrupt that process somewhere along the way can be super challenging for people.
Yeah. Well, you're such a wealth of information and insight on all these subjects, and there are various portals we could go down here. You know, we really didn't spend too much time even exploring internal family systems. So maybe at some point we can have you back on the show.
I would love it.
And in closing, could you just speak to this thing that I've heard you say today, I've heard you say many times in my work with you, self-energy.
Right.
What is that? So much of what you're emphasizing here is slowing down, is connecting to self, connecting to the body, taking some breaths, inquiring, what is true? What is this? And being able to also relay and communicate that in a healthy way to your partner or whoever you're, in relationship with in that moment. So this thing called self-energy, what is that?
Yeah.
As a final takeaway here, and how can we get more of it if it's a good thing?
Right. So it is a term used by Dick Schwartz, who created internal family systems, the self. So we have self or self-energy, which I preface as like the essence of who we are. It's sort of like the core of who we are, or some might say our soul or our being or I, or however we want to relate to it. Where I also sort of intertwine regulation, that when we are grounded and centered, which is one of the 8 C words that makes up self-energy, is when we feel connected and grounded and centered to our being, is part of self-energy. Then we also have, and we can kind of go into this if you were to have me back, but the different parts of ourselves. We have aspects or emotions of ourself, our being. When we're in self-energy, we're connected to ourself and others. We have compassion. We can be curious. We can be creative. We can be, I can't remember if I said centered. We feel calm. We have courage. So those are some of the C words. So when we're in those states, we feel a sense of connected to me, and I can connect with you, and I feel grounded and stable. From that place, like I was saying earlier with regard to, say, frustration or anger, if I'm in this place of stability, then I'm better able to address any sort of emotions that might come up. So coming back to this place of being centered and grounded, for some of us can be really hard. That in and of itself is, it can be a feat. But when we have access to that, it just makes it so much easier to have conversations that are difficult, or where we feel charged, or where we might feel confrontational. So that it's kind of like, okay, I'm here, I'm grounded, I'm stable, and I'm able to meet you with whatever emotions are coming up. And yeah, I might get triggered, but I'm not so destabilized that I need to flee.
Yeah.
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 Or fight back.
Yeah.
It's like, can I stay connected enough to hear what you have to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of threatening the relationship
Right,
or
exactly.
blowing things up.
Yeah.
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 Well said. Well,
Thank
Melina,
you.
thanks for coming on the show.
Thank
Before we
you.
wrap up, anything else that you want to leave us with? Any closing thoughts?
No, I don't think I have anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I think I've probably said more than
You
gone
shared-
off on some tangents.
You shared so
thanks
much. I
so much
appreciate it.
for-
I'm sure everyone listening has their own burning questions that want to explore and pull some of these threads. So I'm sure we'll have another conversation in the future.
I'd like that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nick.